We've been looking at the Beatitudes, talked about the poor in spirit and those who mourn. And the one this evening is the third of the Beatitudes. And I don't know if you've noticed, but every one of those Beatitudes has a promise associated with it. Now, I've chosen to use the wording of the King James, and I've got a reason. It's, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." It's a very short, succinct statement of blessing for those who are meek. Now, every other version that I've looked at seems to substitute the word gentle for meekness. It's true, meekness is an archaic word. It's no longer in common use today. And I think it's a shame because the word meekness conveys something much deeper and I think more important than gentleness or humility, which are close synonyms. I heard this statement one time, and I think it's worth considering. There's only one place in Scripture where Jesus describes himself. Now, there's many descriptions of Jesus made by others, but this is a self-description. He says in Matthew 11:28, "Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for I am meek and lowly in heart, and you shall find rest unto your souls." Now, isn't it kind of amazing that the creator of the universe, the Son of God who lived in perfect righteousness and died a substitutionary death and will be exalted through all the ages of eternity as being worthy of all adoration and praise. Isn't it interesting or amazing that he would describe himself as meek and lowly? Now, I suggest to you that the word meek today has a negative connotation, and it's not well understood. And I'd like to help us understand the true meaning of that concept. The word meek or meekness in classical Greek, before the time of the writing of the Bible, also had a negative connotation. It was viewed as a defect in character. Now, some of the Greek philosophers tried to raise it to a more exalted meaning, but they never raised it to the level of the Christian teaching of meekness. I'd like to read a definition here. I'm probably getting a little ahead of myself. But this is something I think captures the biblical meaning of meekness. It's a quality of spirit that is able to rest in the goodness and sovereignty of God. And it can therefore submit to every circumstance as coming from his hand. Now, we say that we believe God is sovereign over all circumstances. We say we believe what it says in John 15:5, "For without me you can do nothing." Well, is that an exaggeration or is it true? I think the God who created and sustains the universe is able to control circumstances and direct people in his sovereignty so that we can say and trust that God is able to only allow those things in our lives, circumstances and people, that he permits. We read maybe about the life of Job, and he didn't understand, but God permitted those things. And we probably recognize in retrospect some of the things in our own lives that God permitted that we would never have chosen. But looking back, we can say they've been good. God did good. Continuing this definition, it's primarily an attitude toward God which does not resist what he permits. And it issues out toward people as a strength of character that is willing to endure ill treatment from an enemy of Christ or to accommodate the weakness of an immature brother. It's not the weakness of someone who can't help himself, but it's rather the strength of someone who restrains his power for the sake of a higher good. It's closely linked with the spiritual fruit of humility and self-control, Galatians 5:23. And meekness will display forbearance. It's non-retaliatory. It seeketh not her own, and it's not easily provoked. Those are things that are true of the scriptural concept of meekness. In our day, it's usually thought of as weakness and something that's also more of a contemptible quality. People look at Christians and they think of them as doormats, maybe. But there are two people described in the Bible as being meek, singled out for that description. One was Jesus Christ. The other was, we see it in Numbers 12:3, the man Moses was very meek above all the men who were upon the face of the earth. Now those two men, if you know anything about their character, they were by no means weak. They were very strong characters, but they were self-controlled and, you could say a lot of things about them, but they were not weak. I don't think anybody here would think that of them. Now here's something interesting I found in an old dictionary, Noah Webster's 1928 edition of an American Dictionary of the English Language. It lists in there several definitions of the noun and the adjective, but there's a verb form of that word meek. It's to meeken. Now, we don't have that word in our language anymore. It's archaic, but it means to make meek, to soften, to render mild. It's the word you'd probably use if you wanted to talk about breaking in a horse. Or in current language, we also have words like to tame, or even, I found one, to gentle a horse. But I like the word meeken. If we understand what meek really means, or meekness, to meeken a horse is one thing, but to meeken a man. Think about our own lives. In the time that we've been Christians, has God ever brought anything into our lives to meeken us? How do we react to adverse circumstances? How do we react to criticism or unfair treatment or misrepresentation or anything like that from another person? Does it cause us to want to retaliate? Or would we consider that God is there, He's aware of the situation, He's allowing it, and maybe it's something He brought on purpose to conform us to Christ in some way? I've found several places in Scripture that we find God dealing with some of His servants to meeken them before He can send them on a mission. Moses, for instance, he wanted to deliver his kinsmen according to the flesh. They're in Egypt. They were being mistreated by the taskmasters. And he tried and failed. And then he had to cover up. And then it was discovered, and Pharaoh was mad when he found out. And so Moses had to flee. He went to Midian, worked for his father-in-law Jethro. For 40 years he tended the sheep there. And he had been high up in Egypt. He was probably the number 2 man, even maybe slated to be the next Pharaoh. I don't know about that. He was educated in all the ways of Egypt. And here he is tending sheep in a nowhere place. And you can imagine what he may have thought about himself and his position. I was just trying to do good, God. I was trying to do what I thought you wanted me to. Well, as it turned out, that is what God wanted him to do, but not that way and not at that time. If Moses had accomplished what he was trying to do then, 40 years earlier, he might have delivered a few, but he'd probably be at the loss of a lot of lives. 40 years later, when he actually did deliver, the only loss of life was on the Egyptian side. And he did a complete job. Well, that's kind of going more into it more than I wanted to. But after that 40 years, you know the story about the burning bush. God appeared to him and said, I want you to go rescue your people. By that time, Moses had been meekened, I believe. He said, who am I that I should go unto Pharaoh and that I should bring forth the children of Israel out of Egypt? We see that in Exodus 3:11. Peter had denied his Lord after publicly proclaiming, even though all men shall be offended because of thee, yet will I never be offended. Though I should die with thee, yet will I not deny thee. Likewise also said all the disciples. Afterward, we know the story. He denied the Lord 3 times, just as the Lord predicted. And then he went out and wept bitterly. I believe he had been meekened. And I believe then God could use him, because a short time later, after the resurrection, those 3 denials were offset by his 3 affirmations that he loved the Lord. And the Lord said, all right, feed my sheep, feed my lambs. And Peter did that. I suppose during that short interval after he wept, bitter tears of remorse for having done what he vowed he'd never do, I suppose he thought he was no more use to the Lord. But the Lord had a use for him after he was meekened. Paul, he had a burden in his heart for the Jews. He even would have foregone his own salvation for the sake of his brethren, his kinsmen after the flesh, if it were possible. Of course, it was not. And he thought at one point, early in his Christian life, that God should use him as the apostle to the Jews rather than Peter. God's reaction to that was, make haste and get thee quickly out of Jerusalem, for they will not receive thy testimony concerning me. And then he said, depart, for I will send thee far hence to the Gentiles. Well, that was a blow to him, I think, because he was more qualified than Peter. I mean, he was a Pharisee of the Pharisees, a Benjamite, educated in the law, and all those sorts of things. And Peter was just an ignorant fisherman. But God doesn't always use the most talented or the wisest. Later, down the road some years, Paul would say this, who is sufficient for these things? Not that we are sufficient of ourselves to think anything as of ourselves, but our sufficiency is of God. He'd learned a lot of lessons by that time, and I believe Paul had been meekened. In other words, he was able to trust the goodness of God, that God allows things that are sometimes not pleasant for a good purpose. And though he might not understand, he was willing to trust the Lord and submit his will, even though he didn't understand. This is true of all of those men, I believe. Now, I'd like to give you, and for the sake of time, I won't elaborate on any of these. I'd just like to read some scriptures of demonstrations of meekness in the Bible. Now, the first group talk about Jesus Christ. Now, I want us to understand that, well, it should be obvious, Jesus had no sinful nature like humans do. In his humanity, he took on qualities of meekness and lowliness, and it was in perfect dependence on his Father's will. He refused to assert his own will, rather wanted to do the Father's will. He didn't hang on to his own prerogatives or his own rights, and it was for the sake of us who are heirs of salvation. Here's a few verses that illustrate the meekness of Jesus. For even hereunto were ye called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example, that ye should follow his steps, who did no sin, neither was guile found in his mouth, who, when he was reviled, reviled not again, When he suffered, he threatened not, but committed himself to him that judgeth righteously. That's 1 Peter 2, 21 to 23. Here's one from Isaiah 53:7. He was oppressed, and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He is brought as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before her shearers is dumb, so he openeth not his mouth. Isaiah 53:7. Here's one from John 19:9 through 11. Pilate went again into the judgment hall and saith unto Jesus, Whence art thou? But Jesus gave him no answer. Then saith Pilate unto him, Speakest thou not unto me? Knowest thou not that I have power to crucify thee, and I have power to release thee? Jesus answered, Thou couldst have no power at all against me, except it were given thee from above. Therefore he that delivered me unto thee hath the greater sin. Isaiah 56, verse 6. I gave my back to the smiters, and my cheeks to them that plucked off the hair. I hid not my face from shame and spitting. Matthew 26:67. Then they did spit in his face, and buffeted him, and others smote him with the palms of their hands, saying, Prophesy unto us, thou Christ, who is he that smote thee? Do you see the restraint there? He had all power. He could have wiped them out with a word, but he had a greater reason not to. And here's John 18:11. Then said Jesus unto Peter, Put up thy sword into thy sheath. The cup which my Father hath given me, shall I not drink it? Then Jesus said unto him, Put up thy sword again into its place, for all they that take the sword shall perish with the sword. Thinkest thou that I cannot now pray to my Father, and he shall presently give me more than 12 legions of angels? But how then shall the scriptures be fulfilled, that thus it must be? It's Matthew 26:52 through 54. And then finally, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is set down at the right hand of the throne of God. That meekness of Jesus Christ looked beyond the present circumstances to the ultimate good that it would accomplish. And I think that's probably the key for any of us who aspire to meekness. Looking beyond the circumstance or the insult or anything negative for the purpose that God intends it. It's a restraint that's a sign of power. Here's David. David said to Abishai and to all his servants, Behold, my son Absalom, which came forth of my bowels, seeketh my life. How much more now may this Benjamite, Shimei, do it? Let him alone, and let him curse, for the Lord hath bidden him. Remember that incident when he was running from his own son? And here's Moses. By faith, Moses, when he was come to years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he had respect unto the recompense of the reward. Looking beyond and seeing God's goodness in it. And then here's another one in Moses' life later on. And Miriam and Aaron spake against Moses because of the Ethiopian woman whom he had married, for he had married an Ethiopian woman. And they said, Hath the Lord indeed spoken only by Moses? Hath he not spoken also by us? And the Lord heard it. Now the man Moses was very meek above all the men which were on the face of the earth. And just a few verses later, instead of retaliating in some way, he prays for them. Prays for Miriam to be cleansed from the leprosy. Paul was another example of meekness. And when they had laid many stripes on them, that's Paul and Silas, they cast them into prison, charging the jailer to keep them safely, who, having received such a charge, thrust them into the inner prison and made their feet fast in the stocks. And at midnight Paul and Silas prayed and sang praises unto God. And the prisoners heard them. And you know what happened after that. The Philippian jailer was saved and several others, his whole household. But Paul demonstrated meekness in his actions there. And then here's one that's about the Hebrew Christians in the book of Hebrews. For ye had compassion of me in my bonds, and took joyfully the spoiling of your goods, knowing that in yourselves ye have in heaven a better and enduring substance. They could have complained. Instead, they rejoiced. They could have tried to get even, I suppose, in some way, but they did not. And because they looked beyond that to the enduring reward. I've listed a lot of verses here, every occurrence of the word meek or meekness in both the Old and the New Testament. There's a bunch of them here. One in Psalm 25:9, the meek will he guide in judgment, and the meek will he teach his way. Psalm 37:11 here, it's very similar to the Beatitudes we started with. But the meek shall inherit the earth, and shall delight themselves in the abundance of peace. These are promises associated with meekness, and they generally talk about sometime in perhaps distant future. But they're glorious promises. And this one that's associated with the Beatitude in Matthew says, Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. I believe that's primarily talking about the millennial period, and the Jewish promises and their expectation was for the earthly kingdom. Now, we Christians are looking more in the realm of the heavenly kingdom, but there's going to be a period of time on this earth when Jesus Christ will be on the throne and righteousness will prevail. It'll be a glorious time, and the meek are going to have an important part to play. And I believe perhaps that promise about the meek will he guide in judgment, it'll be associated with their role as judging in this earth. There's many other things could be said about meekness, but I'm hoping that this redefinition of the misconception of the word meek is helpful to you. And I hope you understand it as a strength of character, something that God values very highly. There's verses in the New Testament that talks about how highly he values that quality. And it's something we need to aspire to. It's a fruit of the Spirit. We can't manufacture it on our own. And yet, God is doing that. He gave us a spirit to change us and to be what we are not, what we were not. And we think of spiritual things in a different way than before we were Christians. And this meekness may not have been a very valuable thing to us before, but I'm hoping that we'll see the value more and more.